Welcome to the mixing lesson of the course. So this is a really crucial and critical part of the course because most of your success with working with resin is going to hinge upon how you mix the two parts. This is where a lot of mistakes are made. This is where we see people becoming frustrated or not achieving the results that they want to when it comes to their final finished piece. Everything about mixing is really about precision and patience. And so precision-wise, we need to make sure that as we are using a 1-to-1 ratio epoxy resin, that we actually keep it 1-to-1 ratio, which means that we need to have equal parts hardener and resin. It's so important to keep the ratios right, or else you're going to run into your pieces not curing correctly at all, or maybe they'll be sticky afterwards. But either way, this is really important. And the second part is patience. When you are mixing your resin, it's so important to take your time. Don't rush the mixing process or it'll cause problems further on down the road. So let's start out by looking at what we have here on the table. So what I have on the table are my resin crafting essentials. I'm going to have these on the table every single time I'm working with resin because they're all important. Number one is my rubbing alcohol. It's for cleaning up spills, or if it ends up on my skin, I'll use this with a paper towel. Then of course I have the resin, the epoxy, and then I'll have some kind of mixing cup, small or big depending on how much I'm going to make. And then I'm going to have my popsicle sticks that I use to stir the resin with. Last up are my gloves. I wear these every single time I touch the resin when it's wet, and also when I'm picking up the bottles, and anytime I'm moving the wet molds, always have my gloves on. That's just key. I like to make sure that my hands are covered because it's a chemical. We're working with a chemical here and I don't want it on my skin. So now that I have my gloves on, let's introduce the star of the show, the resin. So I love the Art and Glow brand. I love it. It always cures really clear. It's great to work with. I've never had a problem with Art and Glow. I've tried other brands, but it's just the one that I like. There are others on the market, and for sure try out which ones that you want, but I like Art and Glow. As you can see, there are two bottles here, okay? When you're dealing with epoxy resin, you're gonna have a resin and a hardener. So these are the two that you're going to mix to create your resin pieces. You can't just use one, you have to use both to create it. So I'm gonna get my little measuring cup. Sometimes when I'm using the smaller cups, it's kind of hard to see the lines on them, but I tried to zoom in as best as I could. But you can mix however much you want. They just have to be equal parts. With these cups, you can really mix a very small amount if you want to. You can even take it down as far as 1/4 of a fluid ounce if you really wanted to. I usually just keep it simple and mix up the maximum in this cup, which is 2 tablespoons. Now there are some people who will put hardener in one cup and resin in the other cup. I started out doing that and I always ended up having a little bit more of one than the other because the hardener is actually thinner than the resin is. The resin is thick. It comes out very slow, and the hardener is thin and comes out really fast. And so when you're mixing in 2 separate cups by putting hardener in one cup and then resin in another, you're ending up never truly having an equal amount. So I switched to just pouring them into the same cup right off the bat. I'll start off with the hardener, which is the thinner one, and I'll pour that in first. And then after that, I'll pour in the resin, which, like I said, it's thicker. You can see how it's kind of like a syrupy consistency. And I'll make sure that I make it to the 2 tablespoon line, which means that I have exactly 1 tablespoon of each. Now here I'm showing you that I've poured 2 separate sets of cups. So each cup has resin and hardener in it, okay? And so for one, I'm going to mix it really fast. This was another mistake I made when I first started out. I just wanted to hurry up and mix it and pour it. I knew that I only had about 40 minutes, if that, of work time. So I was like, okay, let me just stir it really quickly and then start pouring it and whatever. You're gonna see that when you stir your epoxy quickly, like really fast like this, you're creating air pockets within the liquid. You're introducing air into the liquid, which is causing there to be air bubbles, pockets of air that are trapped inside of it. And once they're in there, it's hard to get them out. Now, you're always gonna have some air bubbles. That's just the name of the game. You're always going to have some, but you shouldn't have this many. This is a nightmare when it comes to curing, okay? So now I'm going to switch to the other cup and show you the right way. So mixing at a slower speed. Take your time. It can take you anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes to stir it properly and thoroughly. As I'm stirring, I'm scraping the bottom of the cup, inside the corners of the cup, around the edges of the cup, anywhere that unincorporated resin or hardener might have clung to the side or the bottom of the cup. I'm scraping it up and I'm mixing it in. Thoroughly mixing with patience is key here. I know that it's like long and tedious, but it's necessary in order for your piece to cure properly and thoroughly and not be sticky on the other end. It's important to mix it right. When we mix it too quickly, we also might not be mixing it thoroughly. Just because you're doing it fast, it doesn't mean you're doing it right. So when you're taking your time and you're being patient, you can really incorporate all of the components correctly. So if you look closely here, it's looking clearer, but you can see like wisps of white. So there's like these thin white wisps throughout the liquid, and you do not want that. If you see that, like it's 95% mixed, you might be tempted to stop here, but keep scraping those edges, keep mixing until there's no white wisps left. Another component to making sure that you don't have a ton of air bubbles and that your resin will cure correctly is mixing in an environment that's not too cold. If you live in a climate where it's colder, or you're mixing in like a basement area that is kind of chilly, really think about bringing in some space heaters or something, because if the resin is too cold, it's never going to cure correctly, and also you're going to have a lot of air bubbles in it. In fact, you'll get micro bubbles, which are even smaller than the ones that I showed you earlier, and they're going to be throughout the piece, and it'll almost look cloudy afterwards because those pockets are so tiny and they're just everywhere. So here you can see the side by side. The one on the left is mixed slowly and the one on the right was mixed really fast. The one on the right has almost a foam across the top, which you do not want, and the one on the left is more clear. There's a couple of bubbles, but those won't be hard to pop with a heat gun. But here, this foam, it's a mess. Just throw it away. It's not worth it. The only time I would use that other one is if I were gonna mix paint into it, and like that's how you could salvage that. But even then, you run the risk of it not being properly mixed, so you'd be doing that at your own risk. But if I end up with something like what's on the right, I usually just throw it away. All right, so to recap, the 4 main things to remember are: 1, proper mixing leads to proper curing. Number 2, pour with precision. Keep that 1-to-1 ratio. Make sure that your measurements are on point. Number 3, mix slowly. Take your time, be patient. And number 4, mix and store your resin in a room that is between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything colder and it won't cure, and then you'll have all kinds of micro bubbles, and anything higher than 75 degrees Fahrenheit and your resin is going to cure really fast, so you'll have less work time. So just keep that in mind when you're mixing and pouring. And that's it for this lesson.